Uh, we have a big subject. I think we should plunge right in for this first plenary session of the Global Strategic Review. I hope you all enjoyed dinner last night, and on behalf of the ISS, I'd like to again record all of our thanks to the Mayor for making that wonderful facility available to us. I'd like also to thank the speakers from our host nation supporter partners, Carl Bildt and Bert Pedersen from Sweden and Norway. And I'd really also like to take this opportunity to thank the ISS Council member who is forward deployed here in Norway, Grace Skaugen. I can't see her, but I know she's in the room. And she has been invaluable to us in the preparation not only of last night, in which she played a significant role to bring about, but in the general preparation of the Global Strategic Review as a whole. So I think we want to commend her for that and to place that also formally on the record. Thank you, Grace. Now, by word of explanation, we were, of course, to be joined this morning by Zbigniew Brzezinski, former US National Security Advisor, and unfortunately, almost immediately prior to his boarding his flight, he did have an encounter with a little bit of illness, and it was decided that on that basis it was not wise for him to travel. But I have been in contact with him, and he's even taken the time and done us the courtesy of forwarding his notes for the talk that would have been today, and we'll see if we can't distribute those in some way here at the conference or indeed subsequently on our website. But I think just by way of introducing this subject, I would share a number of the thoughts that he would have shared with you had he been here in person. And basically, his view is that the Russian actions seen to date represent a long-term threat to the values and the well-being of the West. He feels that the moment of truth in the conflict has yet to come. Putin seems determined to destabilize Ukraine, and the West is yet to prove that it is truly determined to impose prohibitive costs on Russia for its use of force. And yet, Brzezinski argues that what he sees as Putin's nostalgia for an imperialist past can only for a while motivate nationalistically the Russian masses. It cannot compensate for Russia's vulnerabilities, among which he lists its economic weakness, the desire for its currently cowed, he says, middle classes for closer ties with Europe, the challenge that a rising China poses in Central Asia, the increasing uneasiness of states notionally close to Russia, such as Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan at Russian actions. Importantly also, the increasing need to cooperate with the West on the Middle Eastern crises, quote, before the wildfire leaps into Russia, unquote. Russia, of course, having a significant Muslim population. His overall conclusion is that America and Europe therefore can and should be able to convince Russia that a strategic accommodation is in its best interests. In brief, clarity of purpose, transatlantic unity, strategic determination. If Russia persists and the crisis lasts, military power will have to return to Europe in force. And he most recently sent an addendum in which he makes a specific recommendation in respect of US policy. He says that President Obama, in the wake of President Poroshenko's speech to Congress on Thursday, I think, should publicly announce a change in the US position regarding arms deliveries to Ukraine. He should announce that there will be no such shipments of weapons if the ceasefire is genuinely observed, but that any Russian violation would prompt US shipments of defensive weapons to Ukraine. So that is just, as it were, an amuse-bouche for the speech that would have been, and as I say, we'll try to do what we can to make the broader text available to you. It is a pleasure, however, now to be able to call on members of the Council and the ISS staff to step into the breach and to provide us with their perspectives on this issue. And to do that, we're joined by Francois Heisbourg, who is the chairman of the ISS Council, Samuel Charap, who's our senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia, based in our Washington, D.C. Office and very close to policy debates there, and Igor Yurgens, also a member of the Council and chairman of the Institute of Contemporary Development in Russia. Their full bios are in the ISS Global Strategic Review app, which I hope all of you will have by now downloaded. So they will speak in the order that I introduced them in. And François, please, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's great to be back here in Oslo, because the last time the IISS had its annual conference here in Oslo was exactly 25 years ago, in the momentous year of the beginning of the exit from the Cold War. So it may be sort of apposite to be meeting again here to talk about what some people are beginning to style as a new Cold War, although I don't take exactly that view. On some points, I'll be pretty close to Zbig's analysis. I had the opportunity of seeing him in Washington some time ago, so we've been able to compare notes. And on others, I will differ, and I will, in effect, pose a number of rhetorical questions as a guide to our discussion here. The first question is the Ukrainian crisis basically different from other post-Cold War crises in Europe or indeed the world? And the short answer is yes, because of not the seizure of Crimea, but the annexation of Crimea, the formal incorporation of a territory belonging in international law to another country by a predator country is an exceedingly rare act, certainly since the end of the Second World War. And if you strip out those annexations which were linked to decolonization processes like the seizure of Goa by India, East Timor by Indonesia, Western Sahara by Morocco, and so on, you end up with an incredibly short list, which includes the seizure of Kuwait, which Carl Bildt mentioned yesterday evening by Saddam Hussein, and in a more disputable manner, the incorporation of Tibet by China. So this is a very unusual practice. This is really different. It's not simply different from post-Cold War practice, it's actually different from Cold War practice, because during the Cold War, these things were not done either. So this helps explain the acuteness of the crisis. Second question, is Russia turning her back on the post-Cold War system? Is she in effect exiting the system such as it is, which was set up as a result of the end of the Soviet Empire and of the Cold War? And here again, the answer is yes. You get a very strong sense when you go to Moscow these days and when you talk with President Putin's advisors, with the analysts from the strategic community and so on, that indeed the annexation of Crimea heralded the opening of a new period in which the West's supposed rule book no longer applies. And a talented pro-Putin analyst like Sergei Karaganov has formalized this with his repeated comparison between today's Russia and post-Versailles Germany. This is, in effect, the end of what used to be called during the 1920s Erfüllungspolitik. And that has, of course, a corollary, because if this is true, that is, if Russia is bent on recreating a form of empire, if it is bent on working outside of the rules which were those which it had herself helped to draw up after the end of the Cold War, then this means that this is indeed a long-lasting crisis. And here I completely agree with Brzezinski. And when Western business people, particularly in the energy sector, ask me, how long is this going to last? When will we be able to get back to business as usual? My answer is, I can understand why you want to go back to business as usual, but the problem isn't that the West is going to prevent the return of business as usual at some stage. It is that Russia is not actually very interested in the return to business as usual. And as long as one hasn't integrated that dimension, there will be, how to put it, serial disappointments. I would also add that this narrative, this post-Versailles narrative of a weak Russia upon which Versailles-like constraints were inflicted by a West bent on punishing Russia is rather bizarre, because after all, none of us annexed any Russian territory. We imposed no indemnities on Russia. Indeed, I remember Germany lending at extraordinarily favorable rates 40 billion Deutschmark in 1990 in order to facilitate the process of what became the reunification of Germany. So I don't really see the Versailles, the traits of the Versailles Treaty and what has happened. But this narrative is extremely deeply entrenched in the Russian elite psyche. And this leads to the third question. How long, when I said this is going to last long, how long is long? How strong is this change that we are witnessing? Well, the short answer is it's very strong, and it's going to last a long time. And here I would beg to differ a little bit with Spig. This is not primarily about President Putin. President Putin is a man who has a vision. He's certainly extremely adept tactically. Whether he has a strategy is another question. But this policy enjoys very broad popular support and very deep elite support. The opinion polls by Levada are serious opinion polls. Levada is not a cat's paw of the Putin establishment. And when, after 6 months of sanctions, after 6 months of very slow Russian growth, you have an increase in Putin's popularity, which moved up from 80% to 85%. Dream on Obama, dream on Hollande. You must sort of assume that this is not going to dissipate very readily. And this is not about Putin. This is not even about the regime. It is about Russia, the Russian narrative. That has a corollary, which I hope is a mitigating corollary, although in a certain configuration it could actually make the situation even worse. And that is strategies by the West which would aim at destabilizing Putin or giving that impression. And much of what we're doing in the field of sanctions definitely gives that impression. Those strategies are basically misguided. Because were they to be successful, whoever comes after Putin would probably not have a very different policy. And if they are unsuccessful, they will combine the impression of provocation with the reality of ineffectiveness, which is the worst possible combination. But when I said this could also be turned around and indeed made the situation worse, and that is if this is really about Russia, ultimately, if people become as careless as they were in July 1914, to pick up our historical analogy, the sleepwalking analogy, then of course the outcome would be much worse than anything that we have envisaged until now. I don't expect that to happen, by the way, and we'll talk about that later on. Fourth question, is everything that I have described until now leading to a deeper change in the international system? Is this 1989 redux and the other way around? And my tentative answer here will be probably not, but not necessarily not, if I can put it that way. And let me spell that out looking at three ways in which the Russian the change in Russia and the change in Russian-Western relations could affect the international system more broadly. There are three ways in which this could happen. One is if Russia elected to become an Asian power, Moscow's pivot to Asia, and that this would not simply be at the rhetorical level, but that this would be backed up by a massive shift in demography, in investment, in military deployments, so on and so forth. Despite, and here again I'll refer to our friend Sergei Karaganov, despite the urgings of part of the Russian strategic community, there may be talk about this, but I don't really see any of the metrics I have just described actually being unfolding in the framework of a Asianization of Russia. Second, a manner in which the system could be changed, and that is a Russian-Chinese alliance. That is not so much the Asianization of Russia, but the alliance de revers, to use a French expression, between Russia and China in order to isolate the West. Now, there are obvious complementarities between the Russian and the Chinese economies. There is also necessarily a strong Chinese temptation to play this game, because after all, a Russia which is much weaker than China, with a GDP which is about 1/5 that of China, defense spending which is now about half that of China, and with a growing gap between the two. This is a weak Russia, and since there are complementarities, the conditions seem to be excellent for China to squeeze the maximum it can get from a Russia which has nowhere else to go. And this is one interpretation one can make of the recent gas agreement between Russia and China. China finally got the price which they had been trying to extract from the Russians over the last 10 or 12 years, because the negotiations had been going on the last 10 or 12 years. And when you speak to members of the Chinese strategic community, that interpretation actually comes up quite often. So this scenario has a strong plausibility to it. It has, however, one major drawback from the Chinese standpoint, not to mention the problems it may pose to Russia, and that is that this necessarily affects the Chinese-American nexus. Now, China has all sorts of problems with the United States and vice versa. There are all sorts of sources of friction, but for the time being at least, it does not look as if China had a strong reason to deliberately open a major new front of confrontation with the United States of America. And this again comes across quite strongly when you talk to people in China in positions of responsibility. The disruptive potential of a Chinese-Russian equivalent of Molotov-Ribbentrop or of the Alliance de Revers between France and Russia pre-1914, that disruptive potential, I think, is reasonably well understood in Beijing. But still, it could happen. And in this sense, if that unfolded, yes, there would be a major change in the functioning of the international system. And a third avenue of approach is that, which you sometimes hear in Moscow, but not only in Moscow, one in which Russia would try to structure a rest against the West type of bipolarity in the global system. Now, this can work at one level, and that is at the Russian defense of the Westphalian Pact, neo-Westphalianism, if you want. India loves this, Brazil loves this, most of the so-called former non-aligned countries actually rather like this. But this is more a rejection of things these countries do not want. They don't want to see the Westphalian order fall apart, but it does not provide a positive goal, a positive aim, which would bring all of these countries together. And indeed, one could argue that neo-Westphalianism is also in the ascendant in the West. The so-called coalition, which is being created to counter the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, is an extraordinary manifestation of neo-Westphalianism with a cast of characters which on the face of it looks as improbable as the expedition against the Boxers in 1900, when we had a task force headed by a British general with German soldiers, Russians, Japanese, Americans, Austro-Hungarians, French and Italians. So this may not be the strongest of platforms to create a Russian-centered global order or Russian-Chinese-centered global order. And then there's the other level, and that is the Russian values aspect, because some people say this is not going to be like the Cold War, because during the Cold War ideology was involved. Here you have no ideology. Well, that's not actually completely true. Russian values are counter-revolutionary, and they are societally regressive. On gender issues, for instance. This harkens back to some extent to the Holy Alliance 1815-1830. Can this lead to the structuring of global system in the way that the Holy Alliance did after the Congress of Vienna? Well, not really, because if you take the non-Western democracies, think of India, think of Brazil, or think of others, I don't think they're particularly interested or excited about being part of a West against the West values-based coalition. So in conclusion, I make a couple of prescriptive points. First prescriptive point is, well, what should we be doing, we the West, the Europeans, the Russians, and obviously I'm a European, and I will be reflected in what I'm going to say now, in order to avoid the disruptive potential created by the new Russian policy? Is there, to use that popular expression which you hear a lot in diplomatic circles since the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, is there an off-ramp which we can readily find? The short answer is not in the short run, simply because, for all the reasons I explained, this is going to be a long-running crisis, a long-running problem. It's not something which lends itself to a diplomatic quick fix. But you also heard me say things which are not entirely complementary towards sanctions as the pivot of a strategy, because sanctions actually lead to the deepening of the confrontation while not actually leading to strategic success by the West, to put it in a nutshell. How can one reduce the disruptive potential while at the same time achieving strategic goals which are favorable to the West and at the same time acceptable to Russia? And for me, and this may sound counterintuitive, this means that the answer is in the West providing massive support to Ukraine, economic, political, and military if need be, including military support, not soldiers on the ground, but armaments, etc. The template here being Yugoslavia or Finland during the Cold War. We did these things. The Marshall Plan did apply in Finland, notwithstanding the fact that it had a treaty with the Soviet Union. Why could this lead to a result which is acceptable to the West? Well, what is our goal? Our goal is not to overthrow Putin. Our goal is not to destroy bridges with Russia. Our goal is to ensure that the post-Cold War order, such as it is, continues to prevail, which means no new Russian empire, and countries of the former Soviet Union which are not dragged nilly-willy to that neo-empire around Moscow. So that means we have to make sure that Ukraine is a viable, self-supporting state capable of defending her sovereignty. Why may this be acceptable to Russia? Well, for a rather simple reason, and that is if we provide this sort of support to Ukraine, it cuts both ways. We provided support to Finland not because we wanted to start a third world war. We provided support to Yugoslavia's Tito after Yugoslavia was kicked out of the Cominform in 1948, and when Yugoslavia was threatened with invasion by Stalin's Red Army. And this was not a minor risk. We did not do this to create the Third World War. We armed these countries in order to allow them to defend their sovereignty. From the Soviet viewpoint, this was acceptable because we were not actually enlisting them into what was then the NATO war machine. We were preparing to fight a world war, if need be, defensive world war. And in the case of Ukraine, I think the Russian bottom line, the ultimate bottom line, is Ukraine must not be part of NATO. This comes across quite strongly when you listen to Putin, and it's worth listening to Putin. So a strong Ukraine supported by the West is a Ukraine which can be convinced to play the same role as neutral states did in Cold War Europe. And just in closing, minor, smaller points. I've used historical analogies in my presentation, and we all implicitly or explicitly use historical analogies. And indeed, they play a major role in this crisis. An instrumental role, certainly from the Russian standpoint, when Ukrainians in power in Kiev are deemed automatically to be henchmen of Bandera and Nazis. When every shell which falls on Donetsk is a remake of the 1 million dead in Leningrad between 1941 and 1944. That's the instrumentalization of analogies. But we also have the locking in phenomenon, which can be produced by the misuse of analogies. I mentioned the sleepwalkers. Angela Merkel mentions the sleepwalkers. François Hollande mentions the sleepwalkers. Christopher Clark's excellent book, by the way. It's a fantastic book. We run the risk of locking ourselves into the World War I analogy, because the lesson of that analogy is everything must be done to prevent war between the great powers. Very clear lesson, very strong and entirely appropriate in that setting. Of course, the memory of World War II is the other way around. Memory of World War II is that if you want to avoid world war, you do not appease systematically the contending great power you are dealing with. On the contrary, you have to display firmness and determination. That's the opposite lesson of July 1914. So we have to be quite careful when we use these analogies to use them as tools to help thinking and not to lock us into a predetermined policy course. I would not normally need to say this, but because this is a prominent feature of the current handling of the Ukraine crisis, because we are in the 100th anniversary of World War I, and because heads of state, such as those whom I have named, draw upon that analogy to determine their own and justify their own policies, this point is not an academic point. It's a deeply political one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sam.
Thanks, Adam. So clearly the tragedies and outrages of the Ukraine crisis have demanded a response from Western policymakers. But the need for a response does not imply that any response will do. The response thus far has focused largely on punishing Russia and its leaders for their transgressions of international law, rather than on addressing the problems in Western-Russian relations that led to this impasse. A broader strategy, in my view, must start with a debate about how the relationship between Russia and the West in the post-Cold War period unraveled in the tragic way that it did. That debate has begun, but unfortunately, it has been remarkably shallow thus far. On the one hand, there are those, such as the American political scientist John Mearsheimer, who blame the crisis on the enlargement of Euro-Atlantic institutions, saying Western encroachment precipitated Russia's moves, and for them, the solution is to provide guarantees that enlargement will cease. On the other, there are those that focus on the fact that enlargement cemented democratic gains in post-communist Europe and protected vulnerable states from Russian aggression. The solution for them is to quickly grant institutional membership to Ukraine, Georgia, and any other interested and vulnerable Russian neighbor. Both groups, in my view, miss the fundamental question that we should be grappling with today, which is whether Russia can ever be a normal partner for the West. If one believes that the last 20 years demonstrate that Russia is innately hostile to the West and its values, and therefore will never accept genuine partnership, then Western-Russian confrontation and conflict becomes inevitable. Therefore, aggressive efforts to contain or confront Russia in light of the current crisis are both necessary and without significant downside. By contrast, if one reads the history of the post-Cold War relationship in a tragic light, as a series of miscalculations about the compatibility of continued institutional enlargement with a cooperative security relationship with Russia, then there is a need to find a balance between sanctioning Russia for its recent transgressions of international norms and keeping the doors open for better relations in the future. This dispute echoes a key debate in Cold War history about whether the Cold War began due to fundamental contradictions between the West and the Soviet Union or due to a series of misunderstandings and miscalculations on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Yet even those historians who favor the miscalculation explanation do not deny that fundamental contradictions existed between the West and the Soviet Union. Indeed, the Soviet Union was an expansionist ideological power with global ambitions and deep hostility to Western interests. Post-Soviet Russia is without question, at least today, unpleasant and has transgressed a number of key international norms in the past year, but it is not the Soviet Union. In other words, despite the surface similarity between today's debate on Russia, or the debate we should be having, and the historical debate about the Cold War's origins, closer examination reveals the key difference. Fundamental incompatibilities cannot account for the current conflict between Russia and the West. Evidence for that can be seen in how unexpected confrontation between Russia and the West in 2014 was for all parties involved. As late as June 2013, the Russian and American presidents issued a joint statement on enhanced bilateral engagement. And I quote, "The United States of America and the Russian Federation reaffirm their readiness to intensify bilateral cooperation on the principles of mutual respect, equality, and genuine respect for each other's interests," end quote. 9 months later, President Obama would introduce unprecedented sanctions on Russia for its actions in Ukraine. While the current conflict might not have been inevitable, in the months and years leading up to the February 14th Russian invasion of Crimea, the Euro-Atlantic institutional architecture had become increasingly a source of friction between Russia and the West. It should go without saying that institutional enlargement that was embarked upon in the mid-1990s has transformed much of post-communist Europe for the better, an outcome that was far from inevitable in the early 1990s, and, as the Arab Spring demonstrates, unique in its success. But it is equally clear that that path had an inherent flaw from the start, primarily in how it dealt with Russia and Russia's neighbors. The basic premise of NATO and EU enlargement was that the rules were not negotiable. Aspiring members adopted the existing rules, or what the EU calls the acquis communautaire, in order to join the club. NATO and EU officials were given free rein to roam the halls of former Warsaw Pact countries and to impose Brussels rules and recreate new structures in its likeness. The inherent flaw to the decision to extend the institutional status quo in Western Europe to Eastern and Central Europe was that NATO and the EU could never, in this way, fully integrate Russia, largely because Russia would never accept integration on non-negotiable terms. The alternative to an extension of the status quo, a wholesale revision of the institutional order so that Russia could be comfortably accommodated within it, would have been an immense risk. Moreover, Russia was, until recently, so weakened by its own post-communist transformation that it could not block the process and demonstrated no will to do so. Ever since, the West has done its best to manage the consequences of that inherent flaw. What emerged was a balancing act that can be called partnership without membership. And it's also true that that inherent flaw didn't make itself clear until at least the mid-2000s. During the period of increased cooperation and high hopes in the early years of the Putin presidency, and particularly following 9/11, NATO and EU cooperation with Russia was arguably more substantive than NATO and EU cooperation with Russia's neighbors. And Putin of that period used rhetoric that might shock us if Putin were to use it today. Speaking to the BBC in March 2000, he said, quote, "Russia is a part of European culture. I simply cannot see my country isolated from Europe, from what we often describe as the civilized world. That is why it is hard for me to regard NATO as an enemy. We believe that it is possible to speak even about higher levels of integration with NATO. But only, I repeat, if Russia is an equal partner." He was asked subsequently if Russia could join NATO and responded, "Why not?" Of course, once the impossibility of Russian membership became obvious and Western integration with its neighbors accelerated, the relationship more broadly began to unravel. Despite successful cooperation with the West on issues ranging from Afghanistan to nonproliferation to arms control to counterterrorism, Moscow still viewed Euro-Atlantic integration for Russia's neighbors as a strategic threat. To Russia, this threat perception seemed uncontroversial, as its neighbors were being incorporated into political, economic, and security blocs of which it could never be a part. But the West saw Moscow's policy as denying its neighbors the right to make their own choices on foreign and security policy, which was reminiscent of the Soviet Union's attitude towards the Warsaw Pact countries. And this remains the fundamental chasm. A regional integration agenda which, while not intended as an anti-Russian effort by its authors or by the states that aspire to it, Russia cannot and does not desire to join. The Ukraine crisis began in this context, and in the context of this contest for influence in what Europe and Russia used to call their common neighborhood. After obfuscating the issue with claims of genocide against Russian speakers, Putin has actually been quite straightforward about his motives for invading Crimea and destabilizing eastern Ukraine. On May 24th, speaking to journalists in St. Petersburg, he said, quote, "Some of the recent events in Ukraine directly threaten our interests. First of all, with regard to security. I'm talking about Ukraine's potential accession to NATO. As I said earlier, such an accession could be followed by the deployment of missile strike systems in Ukraine, including Crimea, and should this happen, it would have serious geopolitical consequences for our country. In fact, Russia would be forced out of the Black Sea region, an area where Russia has fought for a legitimate presence for centuries." The tragedy in Ukraine itself notwithstanding, the key question for European security today is what to do about the relationship with Russia. The crisis has relegated that partnership without membership model to the dustbin of history. The response thus far has been threefold: assisting and deepening integration with the new Ukrainian government and Russia's other vulnerable neighbors, sanctioning and isolating Russia, reassuring Central and Eastern European NATO members. Effectively, though, this amounts to a doubling down on the institutional enlargement policy, reinforcing previous gains and expanding the institution's reach further east. It is clear that Russia will see these efforts not as a response to its actions in Ukraine, but as an opportunistic continuation of the same post-Cold War policy that it has long decried as a threat to Russian security interests. And a newly assertive Russia is likely to continue to push back against enlargement, and the action-reaction dynamic we are now witnessing will likely accelerate. Under these circumstances, providing new NATO security guarantees or EU integration to ever more vulnerable states on Russia's borders raises the risks of a direct conflict with Moscow. Russia has made it clear that it views keeping Euro-Atlantic institutions out of its neighborhood as a vital interest, while Europe and the US do not view the security of Russia's neighbors as fundamental to their interests. Indeed, the West's continuing insistence that the only path to stability and security in Europe is for Russia's neighbors to be absorbed into Euro-Atlantic institutions is now begetting threats to stability and security in Europe. Acknowledging that fact, however, does not mean that we must accept Russian domination of its sovereign neighbors. Instead, new arrangements are needed that are acceptable to them, the West, and Russia. Achieving such a deal is possible, but it will require all sides to compromise. The West would have to accept that the model that works so well in Central and Eastern Europe will not work for the rest of the continent. Institutional arrangements will have to be acceptable to all parties, including Russia, for them to succeed. Russia would have to strictly adhere to the limits such new arrangements would impose on its influence in the region and to forswear military intervention in the affairs of its neighbors. This is a policy of necessity, and so difficult for statesmen to embrace publicly. It is also abhorrent to many to even contemplate compromising the principles of enlargement that contributed to the successful transitions in Central and Eastern Europe. But the alternative is a confrontation with Russia that the West does not want in order to uphold principles that it will ultimately not be willing to defend. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Igor, please.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Francois and Sam, for very sober and objective analysis of what's going on. I will confine myself to some remarks about the present state of affairs and what we're going to do. And I will draw a little matrix of pluses and minuses for Russia, Ukraine, and the West of the present status quo and what could be the outcome of this serious situation and confrontation. I'll start with pluses for Russia. The situation at the moment might be called a tactical victory. 2 million people plus strategic peninsula with a military base, as just Sam mentioned, safeguarded. The centuries history of struggle for the Black Sea is sort of a one. Economic and political compact of another 3 million people in Donbass is within Russia's reach. There is a potential guarantee of no NATO status of Ukraine. That was the declared aim of the whole operation. There is a split of Eastern Partnership, which Russia so disliked. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus are willing to cooperate with Russia more than it's willing to cooperate with the European Union, though, of course, there are ambiguities. There is a dual containment, which didn't work so far. I mean, the US cannot contain both China and Russia has options in this strategic partnership. Otherwise, it's overextension of US, as Paul Kennedy told us in The Rise and the Fall of the Superpowers, his famous work. There is internal consolidation around national leader, and I think it was number one or number two objective of the present administration when they started the whole escapade. What are the minuses? It might turn out to be a strategic loss, and probably it will be a strategic loss for Russia. There is massive economic loss already. I would estimate at $200 billion for this year of underinvestment and capital flow. There is a split with Europe, which is multifaceted, but historically, prodigal son is again going someplace and not in the family. Shanghai Organization of Cooperation in China and BRICS is not an alternative for modernization of Russia, because Russia needs much more of the technological know-how, capital, and labor force they can provide. One cannot win a protracted conflict with small army and little weaponry. Russia is 146 million people with 2% of the GDP, and consolidated West is 1 billion people with about 40% of the world GDP. So you simply cannot win a protracted conflict with such mass of people and such massive economic power. Consolidation around national leaders starts cracking. It happens in Russia, and I have many examples, including one of yesterday of one of the tycoons who was very loyal to Mr. Putin, arrested on false pretense, which is the internal elite fight. Not probably immediately because of the Ukrainian crisis, but largely because of the creeping nationalization of oil and gas assets, which is inevitable under sanctions regime. And finally, and not this is not the end of the list, but I would stop there, militarization of the immediate abroad of Russia by NATO. That's exactly what Russia wanted to avoid in the first place. So now it created such situation. Ukraine, pluses and minuses. I start with pluses. Ukraine gained its freedom, or regained its freedom, its independence, and its European choice. It was not so obvious during the previous rule. Ukraine will receive a benign external rules imposed on it during this very difficult transition. Alone, I know it's for sure, because we were going through the same process in '91, alone, the country of this caliber, with this historical background and with this economic situation cannot do it. It cannot fight corruption, it cannot find oligarchs, it cannot find many other things alone. Now, it has a benign external rules imposed on it for this very difficult transition. And finally, there are many other pluses, I guess, but finally and most importantly, in terms of the course of the history, which we're living through, this is the real test for the national character of Ukrainians, win or lose. And that, you know, was their problem for many, many centuries, being squashed by Poland, the West, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Soviet Union, and all of that stuff. So now it's a real test for the national character. It's a real serious thing, and I think they will come out with it victoriously. Minuses for Ukraine, a very serious strain for the economic and social equilibrium. It's minus 9% GDP this year, minus 19% inflation in the country. It's a very difficult situation, especially this winter, when electricity, gas, and all other energy sources are under a lot of strain. Minus is a frozen conflict zone for a couple of years at best in Donbass, and a buffer zone of continental rift at worst. And that's a difficult situation for the country which builds up its statehood. Minus is that if confrontation continues, Russia has economic leverage of very significant proportions to try to influence the situation internally. Now, the pluses and the minuses for the West, I'm not going to tell you, because here is the West represented in all its magnitude, but I only would like to say that the West is not without faults. And I will not enumerate all of those faults, and Sam touched upon some of them, but I can only mention one of it, which I mentioned last year at the same strategic review, and before that in Brussels in 2008, 2009, 2010, when I worked for then President Medvedev. Eastern Partnership. Eastern Partnership, the way it was conceived, and sometimes arrogantly Russia was pushed out of it, is a drawback of your strategy. Eastern Partnership, which was Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, but Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, it failed, and sometimes it provoked Russia to be not very constructive, to put it mildly. And we were trying to talk with the European Union not to be a party of it, not to dictate anything in terms of Ukrainian associate membership, but just to take on board some of the legitimate interests of the customs union when it concerned the trade and economic relations of Ukraine, on the one hand with the European Union through DCFTA, free trade agreement, and on the other hand with the customs union, which also had its own interest and its own transit and other fields of competence and fields of interest in dealing with Ukraine. So it's just to mention one mistake, which I think was a strategic one, saying no to any of integrational process between European Union and Eurasian Economic Union. And now I think we hope that that could be reconsidered. So out of these pluses and minuses, what's my take? There is a phase saving for Russia on the pluses side. There is enough of the strain for its economic, political, and military system on the minus side to accommodate this situation and to go through de-escalation. I think the same goes true, the same is true about the Ukrainian situation. Too many minuses, some very serious pluses, and that can be balanced in the escalation process. The West, I don't see any upside for the Western continuation of this situation, economically, politically, and militarily too. So out of this mess, what do we have? Best case scenario, ceasefire, peace talks, special status of these insurgent oblast regions, then EU-Ukraine Eurasian Union Compact of some kind of a big treaty on trade and economic cooperation, back to normal, and by normal I mean Lisbon, Vladivostok, free economic space, and other spaces which we negotiated ever in 2003 and finished negotiating in 2011-12, still negotiating. And nobody said no to this concept of Lisbon to Vladivostok common economic space. And then finally, political and security reset. It would be very difficult, but I don't think it's unimaginable. Worst case scenario, continental rift. And François called it long crisis. It's another way to say the same thing. Continental rift probably will be very detrimental to Russian people, but if handled propaganda-wise, information war-wise well, it can be a very long and serious period of showdown between the West, Russia, and Russia will try to find allies in this long and protracted conflict, which we should avoid at any price. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Igor, for that very useful matrix. I'd now like to turn it over for questions and reactions from the floor. If you'd like to ask a question or make a brief comment, put up your name boards in the way that a lot of people already are, and keep them up so that I can note your name down and we can go along. Can we start, please, with Carl Bildt in the front?
Well, just a brief comment to Igor, and I think it's important to go back in history and see what really happened. You talk about sort of the free trade and the possibility of some sort of arrangement between the European Union and the Eurasia Union, and indeed you have been working for that, so I understand what you are saying, where you are coming from. And indeed, during the Medvedev presidency, finally Russian accession to the WTO did happen. But then we had something called the comeback of President Putin, and I vividly remember what happened. A new concept was put on the table. That was the customs union, without advance warning, in the middle of everything. That was announced. And then eventually the Eurasia Union, which is still to materialize, is going to come into effect next year. We had then started, very difficult after the Georgia war, agreements on negotiations on the new agreement between the EU and Russia. Those negotiations stalled immediately on the economic side. And the message we got from Moscow was all the time, we are not ready for any discussions on free trade, we are not ready to go further on economic issues, we have reluctantly agreed to this WTO, we are not going to go further. And everything stalled from that point of view. But it was, I would argue, the change in Moscow from Medvedev to Putin and a different continental and trade policy that was instituted that made it impossible to go further along that path. It might have been difficult anyhow, that should be said, because there are some substantive issues. Then came the opposition to the Eastern Partnership, but I would argue even there, having been part of that dialogue for quite some time, Moscow didn't care about the Eastern Partnership. They thought it was just a paper. They never asked any questions. They never asked to be included. They consider it as the Brussels talks without any relevance. Then also that changed very suddenly as a consequence of, I think, Putin seeing that the Eurasia Union project without Ukraine was going to be Russia dumped with Central Asia. And that's the change. And what we see now, by the way, that's a further comment on what's happening now, the Eurasia Union will happen the one way or the other. by the 1st of January next year. But what we see is Minsk and Astana now discreetly running to Brussels, not wishing to join, because geography is geography, but expressing more than disquiet, bordering on fear, on what they see as the intentions of Russia also with the Eurasian Union. So I would say that this turnaround that happened with the Medvedev-Putin transition endangered the prospects that were there for integration of the integrations. And I think long term, it's going to be very problematic also for the project of the Eurasia Union. That's just sort of slightly sort of adding to the perspectives that you had.
Dana Allen, please.
I'm not sure it's necessary, but I somehow feel I have to stipulate before asking my question that it's not condoning Russian behavior or engaging in dreaded moral equivalence to ask and wonder how we got here and investigate that clearly and objectively. And I'm just struck by what François suggested in his admittedly dim prospect for an off-ramp or a solution, a strategic solution that could be acceptable to Russia. That you said that part of the package has to be that Ukraine must not be part of NATO, a condition that comes across clearly when you listen to Putin, and it's worth listening to Putin. I'm just quoting you. Couldn't we have more clearly listened and signaled our understanding of that reality before the crisis? And I'm not obviously talking just about NATO, but about the relations between the Eastern Partnership that Mr. Yurgens spoke about. I mean, the clarity of this Russian, basic requirement must have been clear at least, well, it's been clear for a very long time, but it must have been clear at least since about 6 years ago in August, another August, 2006 with what happened in Georgia. So, asking for an answer to this question, if better clarity and understanding about the limits of the expansion of Western institutions might have avoided or headed off this crisis, is not necessarily getting us that far in understanding a solution to it. But I just wonder if you could say something about it.
Thank you. Tetsi Schaffer, please. Seated, but use the microphone at the desk.
I wanted to ask Francois Heisbourg. He spoke about the declared non-NATO candidacy for Ukraine as being the key to a face-saving solution for Russia eventually when the crisis is capable of being resolved. I wonder if you draw a distinction between NATO and the EU and where the EU figures in your vision of the future.
Bastian Giegerich.
Thank you, Adam. I wanted to see whether we can get a little more commentary on this tension between the goal of preserving the post-Cold War order and renegotiating it, because that seems to me, let's put it that way. To me, it is not clear how far that rollback that this would involve should actually go, and where that really hard core of that order starts that is not up for negotiations. In my view, it should not go very far, that rollback, but I was wondering whether the panel could say something on this. And related to that, the question is this a conflict about who makes the rules? Is this about accommodating, on that level, or is it more about the precise content of those rules? I don't know, I don't want to take it too far, but is what Igor has said about the test of character for Ukraine, is this also a test of character for the West, or is this something different? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt?
Just a brief question. Do you think that economic and trade sanction could have a counterfactual effect for Russian economy?
Pascu in the front, please. And could you just very briefly just state your affiliations in each case? I forgot to mention that, just for the benefit of our speakers.
Only to me, apparently. Ioan Pascu, European Parliament. Thank you very much. To me, Putin seems to be beyond the point of no return. So it would be, I would say, unrealistic to expect that he would step down, take everything back, and so on and so forth. If that is true, is there any guarantee that if we deliver Putin ourselves his strategic aim, no membership to NATO for Ukraine, will he stop and not continue further his other plans? And if he does, what about the impact on the international system of what he's been doing up until now, of which you said it's already critical? Second thing would be, if we deliver Putin this strategic objective of denying membership for Ukraine, why do we need to massively support Ukraine? Because if there is a need for support of Ukraine, it's an implicit recognition that Putin will not be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick Redmond, please.
Thank you, Nick Redmond, IISS. Question for Igor. What would your advice be to Western decision makers as they look to formulate policy to Russia now with regard to, on the one hand, preserving the interests and values that they stand for, on the other hand, achieving some sort of off-ramp, and then within that, the extent to which media freedoms, democracy, rule of law, human rights can be protected in Russia? There's some things now where simply the West has to give way, where actually any aid to particular agencies immediately makes them radioactive in Russia. Other ways, still, it's possible to try and tilt the balance over the long term. Thank you.
Jean-Louis Gergrain.
Yes, Jean-Louis Gergrain, Paris, and Sciences Po Paris. I would like to ask a question about how to sort out from this, how to exit this negative sum game, you know. And after the speakers have very well described the situation, the question is, we have in fact very few weeks, perhaps hopefully months, not to be engaged in a kind of a frozen conflict that will last and last, with the sanctions being maintained or even worsen, and the Russians maintaining the frozen conflict situation in the Donbass with, from time to time, military pressures. So how to sort out that? What would you recommend to do? I ask of the three speakers, what would you recommend to do on the Western side and on the Russian side to have a real dialogue and a real negotiation? Because we have never the negotiations between East and West have been so limited. I mentioned yesterday these ridiculous telephone conversations, you know, that are anything but a real negotiation. So what to do?
Sam Svelderai.
Thank you. Sam Salvadure, UK Foreign Office. I was very taken by Igor's listing of the pluses and minuses for everyone, and the description of the off-ramp and the compromise is very compelling. The biggest problem I see is how would we handle Crimea in such a compromise, because it is such an obvious breach of the post-Cold War, well, post-World War II order. And just a comment on the NATO aspiration. Of course, I worked in NATO for 5 years on Ukraine issues, and I have to say that certainly at the time of this crisis, Ukraine's NATO perspective was not existent, really. And so it really is a case of course, we understand this is why Putin, one of the key reasons why Putin took his action, but it has created the problem, as others have said, that he was trying to avoid.
Professor Vladimir Baranovsky.
Thank you. I would like to ask the panel on a little bit longer term calculations concerning this Ukrainian situation. Hopefully, the crisis will be solved somehow, because there are incentives for all those who are involved not to have a worst-case scenario. But my question is about post-crisis development. What will be the next crisis? And my concern is the following. I think that Russia's biggest miscalculation is that by its own policy with respect to Ukraine, it has actually created strong incentives for all those trends that it wanted to avoid or prevent. Just to give one example concerning NATO, which was mentioned. Russia wanted to minimize the role of NATO. The result of all this development is revitalization of NATO. Face-saving solutions about non-participation of Ukraine in NATO, it has already been considered just several years ago. What will happen after the solution, immediate solution of this crisis, I suspect this will be growing attention of non-NATO countries towards eventual participation. This could concern Ukraine, this could concern Finland, this could concern Sweden, and I think that the next phases in the crisis development between Russia and the rest in Europe will be exactly about this. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady at the back, I can only read your first name, and sorry, I do apologize for that. Please.
Nazanin Ansari, Kehan, London. My question regards Iran, and what is the development of this situation between Russia and the West affect relations with Iran, its trajectory, and the status of the negotiations, current negotiations regarding the nuclear program in Iran and the sanctions regime? Thank you.
Mr. Zhang from China.
My question is, who is going to be blamed for this current Ukraine crisis? Most people all over the world said it's because Putin who did all these kind of bad things. But some Americans, especially I read an article by Chicago University. He says it's the US, because US does not address enough Russia's core interest, does not address the Russia influence area. So anyhow, what's the root cause for this crisis? The second one is, I'm very interested in first speaker's conclusion. He says it does not has the global influence on the global system. But he also added that not necessarily not. Could you explain further why not necessarily? If we define it as a regional issue, it surely won't have impact on the global system. Thank you.
And finally, I'm afraid, Sanjay Barrow, please.
You don't have to be afraid, Adam. My question is to my friend Igor Yurgens. I would like to draw him out on his very last sentence, where he referred to the fact that if Russia is pushed into this kind of a confrontational situation with the West, then it would have to look for friends elsewhere, and that this would have very negative consequences for the global order. Who are those friends that would in fact go along with Russia on this issue in the context of Ukraine and Crimea?
Thank you. I'd like to return to the panel now to give each of the speakers about 3 or 4 minutes to respond to the points that they felt were principally directed at them or on which they feel the strongest, and we'll go in reverse order, so starting with Igor, I think.
First of all, what's the outcome? And I guess I can sum it up because there were 2 or 3 questions more or less the bottom line of those questions, where do we go from today to some better future? So today we have a situation when last night, very late, the ceasefire agreement was they added a protocol to ceasefire agreement in for bilateral talks in Minsk. They decided to disengage 15 kilometers each, heavy weaponry withdrawn, exchange of prisoners, and both Russian ambassador and former president of Ukraine, Kuchma, are telling that there are hopes that it will hold, and it's effective from this morning. And I heard from Moscow that, touch wood, they do disengage. Of course, there will be a serious consultations and fights around the status of this Donbass and Lugansk so-called People's Republic, but I think there will be a pressure from Russia for them to be with a special status, but within Ukraine and not as in independent states or autonomous regions or something of that kind. So if today's agreements and negotiations will continue, if that takes us to a lasting peace in the region, then I would argue that next step is associate membership agreement implementation fully on the EU and Ukrainian side with, as it was agreed 1 week ago in Brussels, with some implementation gap on the side of Russia-Ukraine border in terms of customs. So for 15 months, we have time to renegotiate a new deal between European Union, Ukraine, and Customs Union in terms of free transit of goods, services, capital, and people. And that would create the conditions for Ukrainians to sell their product to Russia. At the moment, it's minus 45% of the trade turnover, and that's disaster, because for some of the Ukrainian goods and services, there is no other market. Plus, we have about 4 million Ukrainians work on the territory of Russian Federation, and with their remittance, it's also a source of considerable income for some families, at least. If these two, we have peace, we have trade agreement negotiated, and then the third part would be, of course, major negotiation on, and I hope that by the end of next week we will finalize it, major deal on gas. Because this coming winter is very difficult for Ukraine. They do not have enough of energy source they have enough in the reserves in gas from Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and other sources, but that would not hold for the whole winter. So Oettinger is doing heroic things now in negotiating between Ukrainians and Russians on the transitory or preliminary agreement on the price of gas. That would be the third component. So then we have gas agreement, we have trade agreement, we have peace agreement. That's for the starters. Then I think we should de-escalate piece by piece, and I cannot predict at the moment, so much so that I'm having only 2-3 minutes to reply to all of the questions. Very important question is Crimea. If we put Crimea immediately on the table, then we, of course, derail the negotiations in Minsk, because that will be too much for both sides. I think that the danger or the behavior of Russian Federation in Donetsk and Lugansk was predetermined by this fact. I think the military people told to Mr. Putin that if he doesn't do something in Donetsk and Lugansk, then the new reformed Ukrainian army will go to Crimea, and that will be a major showdown, because we have this Sebastopol naval base, a considerable amount of military people there, and military interests too. So that was a maneuver to keep this Crimean front firm. Now, It's reinforced. To the best of my understanding, they made a huge effort both in Novorossiysk and in Crimea itself, and they are less apprehensive of future developments in Crimea. But if we put Crimea immediately on the table, and if we keep pushing on this issue, then I think that we risk many other things which are in the air. So my guess is that it's a protracted conflict which will be with us like Northern Cyprus for some time. I understand fully that neither Ukraine nor European Union will let it go, but let's take it as a second turn most acute issue after Donetsk and Lugansk, and the integrity of Ukraine the way it stands now. The question, very important question on what to do, what to do, and where is this logical and efficient balance between the pressure on Russia for the internal liberal forces, for the human rights, for the protection of freedom and rule of law, and pragmatic interest of dealing with Russia as an international player and nuclear superpower. I cannot offer anything more intelligent than George Kennan did in his long and short telegram back in '46, saying that, listen, containment, yes, but we cannot solve Russian internal problems from the outside. Only Russian people can do that. It's to the liberals, it's to opposition, it's to new generation, it's up to us to do something. We are doing that, sometimes not very efficiently, but we are building up something which is an alternative to authoritarianism, conservatism, obscurantism, and all of that stuff. I don't think, you know, in 1991, or 1990, or before the collapse of the Soviet Union, people in the West were telling me, oh, Russian people, fantastic people, if not for Communist Party and KGB, they would be like us. KGB gone, Communist Party gone, no, they are not part of you. And this long way to freedom, like Moses, 40 years, we had our 20 years, we turned back like Jews did. But then Moses turned them back to the future again, we didn't. At the moment, we stalled. So it will take some time for this genetic paternalism, for 1,000 years of very difficult development of a huge land mass with less people than needed to control this land mass, with this heroic army and military achievements and all of that stuff. It will take some time to change the mentality. It cannot be changed from the outside. There is no university which can teach Russian people to be free, democratic, and all of that stuff. So from this point of view, my answer is contain the way you can in the most efficient way from your point of view, pragmatically. But don't pin too much hope on the outside benchmarking imposed on Russians, because it will simply will not work. I'm 23 years now in this process. It doesn't work. I guess this is it, because I don't think I have too much time. Huh?
Thank you very much. Sam.
Thanks. I wanted to address Bastian's excellent and somewhat provocative question. I don't think that rollback is the right framework for this, for at least what I suggested. I think it was a good decision in light of what's happened in the last 9 months to consolidate and reinforce existing institutions. There's no question about that. The problem is that doing that alone won't solve the problem. It won't solve the problem either for non-members of those institutions, in particular Ukraine, or for the relationship with Russia. So you have to think about the sort of reassurance effort as important, but not in itself the answer to the broader problem that we're facing. And I think, just to move on to the next point that was raised about what to do, I think that there's a pretty straightforward answer that we haven't seen much of in the last, well, since April at least. I mean, there has to be diplomacy, there has to be negotiations, and sanctions have to be combined with negotiations if we expect them to be effective. As for this question about the next crisis, and I'll leave it at this, and where I differ a little bit perhaps with Francois about why I think this might represent a change in the international system, I didn't mention the Ukraine aspect of this crisis very much in my remarks, in part because we have a crisis in relations between Russia and the West, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. You could resolve that tomorrow, and we would still be in a protracted conflict or confrontation type scenario with Russia going forward. And I think that will prove over the long term destabilizing for European security. And that will be a change in the international system if we don't have the kind of stability on the continent that Minister Bildt described as being, in that quotation from the European strategy document 10 years ago, as sort of central to what we've known over the last decade in terms of European security. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. François, please.
Thank you. First, on this last point, I'd simply try a counterfactual. Let's assume for a moment that what we're witnessing was happening as an outcome of the Orange Revolution in 2004. Assume the US is what it was at the time, Europe is what it was at the time, and so on. We would be talking about a very grave regional situation. We would not be talking about a transformation of the international system. We can talk about a transformation of the international system not because Russia, Ukraine is in and of itself provoking that crisis, but because this is an aggravating additional circumstance in an international system in which the US sees her relative strength being eroded through the rise of others. We are seeing Europe becoming less and less of a strategic actor for reasons which are much more related to internal economic and political governance issues in Europe than because of this or that crisis outside. In other words, the Ukrainian crisis is aggravating and exacerbating trends which already exist. So I don't think we're in disagreement, but it's not Ukraine, Russia in isolation which is doing this. And that brings me to the question posed by our friend from China. If China and Russia were to conclude a permanent anti-American alliance, then one could truly talk about a transformation of the global system being brought about the Ukrainian-Russian crisis. But I haven't seen that happening, and as I explained earlier on, I think there are strong reasons why, at least for the time being, China may want to avoid doing that, and also Russia may find it in its own interest not to be exceedingly squeezed by an overwhelming China, because China and Russia are not playing in the same league. On NATO, the issue of NATO, Jan Pascu asked the question, how can we be sure, and so on. Totally legitimate questions. A militarily toothless Ukraine, an economically disintegrating Ukraine, a politically dysfunctional Ukraine could certainly not provide that sort of assurance. During the Cold War, Yugoslavia and Finland, the Russians knew that these two countries were perfectly able and willing to defend their neutrality against all comers. And the West knew that as well. And this is what made the non-aligned status of those two countries in strategic terms so perfectly acceptable to both of the armed camps. Well, we are not in exactly the same situation as during the Cold War, but I think there are some strong similarities. If only because in Russia, this is not about face-saving. I think Putin takes the NATO issue deathly seriously. It's worth listening to what Putin says and to read what he writes. This, I think, is a basic. It may sound pre-1914 Russian concern, but it is a real concern. I don't think it's an artifact. So meeting that concern, I think, would not simply be about face saving. And of course, from the Western standpoint, what is the best combination? Is it to have no openness and no firmness? This is what is our current characteristic. We have a sanction system which appears to be directed at the Russian regime. That's the no openness part, and the no firmness part, in the sense that we are not actually helping Ukraine to any major extent. And we leave the NATO issue in suspense. It's up to Ukraine to decide whether it wants to join NATO or not, and this is not something we can decide upon in the short run, but we will see in the future. You know, Rasmussen's reaction to the request by Ukraine a few weeks ago to join NATO. We didn't say no, we didn't say yes, we left the issue in abeyance. Something which can only worry the Russians without reassuring the Ukrainians. Perfect combination. This is what we're doing. I would argue that having a much greater firmness, that is, much greater support vis-à-vis Ukraine, and much greater openness vis-à-vis Russian concerns on Ukraine's status vis-à-vis NATO, that is actually a much more acceptable combination from Russia's standpoint, and a more effective one from the Western standpoint than what we are doing now. Is EU different from NATO? It used to be, and I hope it will continue to be, but that depends a great deal on Putin. Until Putin started charging off into Crimea, the NATO debate in Finland, and I speak under the control of Carl, in Sweden, was not a very hot debate. One didn't have the impression that either of these two countries were going to join NATO anytime soon. Now, of course, that is much less clear. And the EU may, as a result, begin to morph into a strategically homogeneous area, which until now it had not been. So this may be one of the self-fulfilling prophecies. The Stodeliat, the what to do question from Jean-Louis Gergorin in the immediate future. Some very strong signaling, quiet but strong, from the West to Russia along the lines, if you go to Mariupol, and if you do the land bridge between Crimea and Mariupol, the following consequences will occur, notably in terms of the massive provision of military aid to Ukraine. This is the one we have to prevent. If the Russians are tempted to do this, to install the land bridge, which is necessary to provide Crimea with the heavy bulk which it requires, including water, because it can't come simply through the port of Kerch. The land bridge is indispensable, and it has to happen before this winter. So this is actually quite a short-term thing, which it is worth deterring. A last point. Christian Schmidt asked about the effects of sanctions being counterintuitive vis-à-vis Russia. The problems of the Russian economy are deep. Igor mentioned them. They are not for the moment linked to the sanctions, at least not yet. They have been ongoing since the failure of Modernizacja, since the beginning of divestment in 2008. Now all of this can be blamed on the sanctions. So politically, Putin can play the Castro. And in that sense, the sanctions may indeed have not exactly the political effect the West may have desired. Thank you.
1 second, I have to reply to my friend Sanjay. I do hope that India is our friend.
Thank you very much. This afternoon we have sessions on Russia's military modernization, a session on the future of Ukraine, in which Igor will again be speaking, in which Sam will be chairing. But for the time being, can I please ask you to come back here at 10:40 for the resumption of the plenary session on the Middle East, and to join me in thanking the speakers for their presentations this morning. Thank you.